Awesome. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining Two Different Township Libraries for an insightful and thought-provoking community conversation with local-ish author Dr. Jordan Shapiro. Hopefully you can see and hear me now. I also wanted to take a quick moment to remind you all of the library's virtual program policy. We all know that there are a variety of viewpoints in the Zoom, and that's a good thing, but please keep the conversation and questions as unbiased as possible. In accordance with Different Township Library's patron behavior policy, the following behaviors will be strictly enforced during this program: behavior that compromises or prevents the continuation of the program, using harassing, abusive, or insulting language towards other participants or staff or presenters, or interfering with the staff's duty of facilitating the program. Any person that violates the patron behavior policy will be handled in a professional and courteous manner. The degree of the violation will determine the severity of the response, which could include being removed from the Zoom webinar. More information about our patron behavior policy can be found online on our website, and I will pop a link in the chat momentarily. With that being said, it is with great pleasure to introduce Rachel Kramer, Different Public Libraries Fundraising Associate. Rachel Kramer is a parent to a 7th grader at Valley Forge Middle and a 4th grader at New Eagle Elementary. She's also a library patron and a staff member responsible for leading the library's fundraising efforts. All these roles led Rachel to, after reading Jordan's book, The New Childhood, suggest an evening with him as a great opportunity for the library and the PTO to work together. So without further ado, Rachel.
Thank you, Zoe. It is so exciting for me to be welcoming Jordan and all of you to this program collaboration with Valley Forge Middle School and the library. It is a worlds colliding for me, and it's just really exciting. I came across Jordan's book last spring, and it left me with my jaw on the floor. Like so many of you, the pandemic increased screen time at my house. It was the place my kids went for school, to see their friends, to see family that didn't live close to us. Especially my older ones started to spend a lot of time online playing games like Minecraft with his friends, and I worried about the amount of time. Then I read this book, and here came this expert author telling me to check myself. I immediately called Un Kyung Ho, VFMS PTO president and a library board member, and said, here, I found the perfect opportunity for the library and the PTO to collaborate. This is the perfect community conversation program. Here's a topic that we all are struggling with, and someone who is providing a totally new to me viewpoint. So she agreed that it was a great opportunity to partner. The library and the PTO share a mission to support families in our community in all the ways that we can. So we added to our team Zoe, who you just met, and Amy Terlecki, another middle school parent and PTO board member, and a library lover. If you go to the library, you can see her art in the foyer. It has been a true pleasure to collaborate with all of these women and with Jordan to bring you the program tonight. So Jordan Shapiro is a globally celebrated American thought leader with roots right here in the Philadelphia area. He attended Friends Select School and even owned a diner in Reading Terminal Market during his time as a chef. Now Jordan is professor of psychology at Temple University, a senior fellow for the Joan Gantz Cooney Center at Sesame Workshop, and non-resident fellow in the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. He writes, speaks, and teaches in the US and internationally about global education, learning through digital play, kids, and culture, and his work has changed the cultural conversation about parenting and screen time. In our pre-meetings for this event, I told Jordan that I was still, and I still am not sure I totally agree with him, but that's beside the point. Jordan's ideas about technology and its importance as a tool for play and growth in kids really made me think, why was I scared? What really were the downfalls of screens? And Jordan pointed out lots of upsides that, of course, I wasn't thinking about as I was asking my son again and again to get off his computer. Jordan's book challenged my thinking, offered tons of new information and ideas, and affected my parenting profoundly. We hope that this talk and Jordan's book will do the same for you. So here is the schedule for the evening. First, Jordan will begin with a summary of the book's key points and his thoughts on how the pandemic and the time we're in now might have changed them. Then Un Kyung will talk with Jordan casually and will ask questions some of you submitted ahead of tonight. After that, we will ask Jordan any questions that you submit during the event. And at any time, please don't forget that you can use the link in the chat to purchase this book that we'll be chatting about, The New Childhood, and Jordan's new book, Father Figure, from Main Point Books. And 20% of the money spent on those books will come back to the library and the PTO. So we thank Main Point Books so much as well for their partnership. So and Jordan, take it away.
Thank you. I just wrote I wrote down the schedule as you said it, so I know what to do. A summary of I'll start with a summary of The New Child, and thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. The only question I have before we start is whether or not should people put their questions in the Q&A or in the chat?
So right now, it'll just be within the Q&A.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah. So we're going to talk about this book, the one that covers behind me, The New Childhood. I'm sitting in my office where I write, so I have both books behind me, or at least giant versions of their covers. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I was doing when I decided to write The New Childhood. And I think what I'll say is I came to The New Childhood. I came to starting to work on this book as a father first, not as an expert. I had no idea that I was going to become an expert in that I was going to become an expert in screen time or parenting. That was about a 10-year journey that led to this book. When I first started to do research and try to understand kids and screen time, it was because it was because I had just been divorced, and my own kids, I wanted to support them through it. They were with me. I had half-time custody. I still do, and I wanted to support them through what was a very hard thing in all of our lives, a big transition in our lives, and all they wanted to do was play video games. They wanted to, they had Nintendo, they had their Nintendo DS. I think it was it was in the days before Minecraft was brand new at that time. It became very clear to me very quickly that were I to say, stop playing those video games and come out on a hike and process your feelings with dad, that would be perceived as a punishment more than a support system. So instead, I started to play video games with them. I sat down with them on the sofa and I started to play video games. I'll be honest, I was never a fan of video games. I grew up in the days of Mario Brothers. I played it a little bit. I played a little bit of Atari, but I was never a big fan of video games, and I didn't think it was something that was very good. I don't know that I thought it was bad, but I definitely didn't see video games as something that was it was positive. I saw it as something that was mostly just an escape or a waste of time. But as I started to play with them, I started to get curious, and I started to do a lot of research, and that's what ultimately led to the book, The New Childhood. Is it became very clear that digital media and digital play was the future of play. Actually, now I think it's the present of play, and all of the information in child development research tells us how important play is. One of the things that gets really confused, I think, because we have a very strong anti-screen prejudice, is that we imagine that non-screen based play is somehow natural and neutral, and that screen-based play is a contamination of something that would be otherwise perfect. And what I discovered as I did the research for The New Childhood is that most of what we consider to even be the essential perfect kind of play is actually all connected to other technological developments, other technological eras. Most of the ways we think of, whether we're talking about playgrounds or sandboxes or sliding boards or anything that we would associate as sort of the idealistic version of what we think is play for kids, it comes out of the industrial era. And so something became really confusing to me, which was, why is it that we prioritize a kind of play that's only been around for about 150 years, and decide that anything that's different from it is somehow problematic? And so that got me to really look into the research about what potential benefits there are from digital play, what potential downsides there are of digital play, and to really look at what it meant to reimagine what childhood looks like in a changing era. So much about what we think of even in childhood, not just in terms of play, is sort of a kind of nostalgic appreciation of times past. We want our kids' childhood to look like the ideal childhood we imagined for ourselves. And I say imagined for ourselves because very few of us had an ideal childhood to begin with, right? There were millions of nothing's perfect. And so as I wrote the book, I tried to identify the pros, the cons, and just to really understand what was the truth beyond our sort of cultural distrust of screen-based media. One thing I will say about screen-based, just screens in general, is we've had more than 100 years of researchers trying to prove that that screens are bad for your health, because basically from the beginning of television, I'm sure everyone remembers their own parents telling them, don't sit too close to the television, it's going to ruin your eyes, it's going to rot your brain. Nobody has been able to prove that there's a toxic impact on the body from screen use in all of that time. Now, some things you might read about, there is some suggestion that screen before bedtime disrupts sleep patterns. This might be the only version of research that I've looked at that says there's a problem with screens that's really dependable and is well done and proves something. Other things like screens are rewiring our brains. I'm sure that's a popular headline people like to write all the time. It's just it may be true, but everything's rewiring our brains. The human brain is plastic and changes, and whether it rewires the brain or not doesn't tell us much at all about whether that's good or a good or bad thing. So I took that as a starting point of going, if there's nothing bad about the screen and its actual immediate impact on our physiologically on our children, then it becomes really a question of culture, really a question of how do we start to understand how they're going to live with it. And the bottom line, when I heard so many parents arguing screens on, screens off, I call it the on-off switch mentality in the book, is that screens aren't going anywhere. They are now part of our lives, and they're part, especially after the pandemic. We're not even after the pandemic, especially because of the pandemic. They are part of our lives. And the real question shouldn't be whether they are good or bad, but rather how are we going to live with them? Because I don't think, and I think most of you would probably agree with me, at least on this point, that screens are going to be out of our lives anytime soon. So the question isn't, should we fret about it? Should we be sad about it? Should we worry about it? As much as it is, how do we do our jobs as parents to best support our children as they move into a world in which screens are just a part of the context? And how do we make sure that they're able to use those screens in healthy ways? How do we maximize the benefits? How do we minimize the liabilities? And how do we just make sure that we raise kids who are fulfilled, who are ethical, who are happy, who are smart, all the things we want for our children. So this is really a book about how to approach screens as the context of the new childhood, rather than a book about what you should worry about or what you should necessarily do about the fact that screens exist. That being said, there was another thing on the schedule that Rachel mentioned, which is to talk about the pandemic impact. And the pandemic impact is interesting. A lot of people have asked me that question, obviously, in the last couple of years. And the first thing is that I think the pandemic, has had some positive and some negative, like anything else. The first thing to understand, the first thing I think about when I think about it is the education in, moving to Zoom school, education technology, all the things that happened in the beginning of the pandemic. And I've been saying this since the very beginning of the pandemic, which is these are not, almost no case that I know of was that done in the best possible way, right? That was an emergency procedure. So we shouldn't let that experience be representative of the possibility of screens in learning, for example, because it was very rare that people managed to leverage that in the most positive ways. As somebody who teaches online often, I can tell you it's taken me years to get good at it. So to expect any teacher to have been able to make that switch in a couple of weeks is naive. So that's an important thing to notice. And I think we all discovered that our children needed those screens at that time to connect with other people and to find a place to play that was an alternative to what exists in a world of lockdown. I think in some ways parents, we know that screen time increased. We know that parents were more likely to pay attention to what kids were doing on their screens. There's been a lot of research about how the pandemic went in terms of kids play and digital play. And I would say, from just anecdotally speaking, I think there's been a real mixed feeling from parents in terms of how that process went. In some cases, it made them a lot more worried about them and in irrational ways. And in some places, I think it made them realize that many of the things that scared them were really fear of change rather than well-founded fear. I think I'll leave it there and start talking to Un, because I think there'll be a lot of questions where I can get into the serious research, and we can do that in a way that's more contextualized rather than me just being a talking head professor, saying words that letting them come out of my mouth. Yeah, you get the point.
Hey, Jordan, thank you so much for being here and for providing that bit of intro for folks that haven't had a chance to read the book. I was really excited when Rachel came to me with this idea of this partnership. We'd been talking about it in sort of this abstract way, like, yeah, we should partner. And it was sort of amazing that this was the book. I also want to shout out her intro. That was a really, really lovely, beautiful intro. And I echo her sentiments. It's been such a amazing, fun experience to collaborate with the folks, Zoe from the library and Amy, my cultural arts VP, to work on this together with you. But, I was so blown away when she brought this book to my attention, because I think, like so many parents, and you articulated this in your intro comments, we're sort of like in this world on steroids, right? Like, when I reflect back on our pandemic experience, it was really sort of like falling down. Screens just became so dominant in our lives in ways that I don't think our family was prepared for. The parents, not necessarily the children, right? Like, everything shifted to screens for our kids in the school sense, and our family was a virtual family. So all of our social interactions that weren't with one another were mediated through technology. And unlike you, I'm so envious at your ability to immerse in that world with your children, because I've struggled with it personally. I'm not a gaming person. It's not something that's hugely of interest to me. I find it really annoying. And I think Minecraft in particular, I don't understand. It gives me a headache. The aesthetics are awful. I don't understand what's happening a lot of times. but that was like my kids' playground. That like school ended and then they were in this virtual world with their friends. That was the real world for them. It's where they wanted to be and exist. And I'm getting to, I'm getting to a question. There was a lot of comfort in reading that initial scene that you lay out in one of the first chapters about your kids' interaction with Minecraft, because it was so familiar to me. And so one of the beautiful things about your book, there's so many beautiful things about your book. And I, like Rachel, I'm still, I consider myself a pretty open-minded person, but I had some pearl clutching moments. And I'd love to discuss those with you. But you do this really beautiful job of connecting it with things that we already understand out of history. And you have all these really beautiful metaphors. One of them is the sandbox, right? All of us understand the concept of the sandbox. One thing that blew my mind was like the history of play and how kind of new it is, that it's not sort of this thing that has been with children and an integral part of their lived experience for a very long time. So I'd love for you to talk about that concept and how it, how like this digital space is the new sandbox.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to do that. I mean, first let me comment, because this is something that that people often, when I say that play is a recent invention, people think that's an absurd comment. So I have to explain it. You know, absolutely, kids have always been, I mean, we don't know, but by any reasonable assumption, we have to assume that kids have always been have always done frivolous things, have always wanted to be playful, right? Have always been prioritized play. And certainly, when we look at the archaeological record, we do find occasional examples of children's toys. They are usually among super wealthy children. I should point out. We don't tend to find them in the peasant stuff that we find in archaeology. But all you have to do to understand the history of how we got to valuing play and to see it as something that is not just a kind of attitude that kids have because they're immature, but rather something we value as a thing to occupy their time, is just realize that for most of human history, we put kids to work as soon as possible, right? We only stopped putting kids to work in the early 1900s in the United States, right? And even that was a fight, right? That was a huge fight through multiple Supreme Court decisions and congressional things just to even make it possible to outlaw child labor, right? Because people thought it was so important. And also, there's a huge religious connection where play is problematic, right? Like, we don't believe that if you think of older religion, older expressions of even current religions, right? Idleness is considered a sin, right? And so you can find papers, if you go back in early American newspapers. I did this while writing the book, where people were writing angry op-eds about the fact that kids were out in the street being idle, right, talking and not working, right, that this was the kind of thing that was going to corrupt the entire community and rain down fury from the gods, I guess. So this idea that we're going to value childhood as a time of emergent growth, of a time of development, as a time of growth in which you move towards becoming a full person, doesn't really happen until the industrial age. Another thing to just point out, that to make that clear, even the idea of an adult and a child is a pretty new idea. And what I mean by that is it's only because of modern medicine that we have such a concept of lifespan, right? There was no such thing as a general lifespan before modern medicine. It was pretty ordinary. It was just as common for someone to die at 4 as it was for someone to die at 40, as it was for someone to die at 84. So there's no notion like we have now that the normal lifespan is supposed to be, as close to 100 years as possible, and therefore we can break that down into categories, right? It was not abnormal for you to have a child, for them to live 4 years, and for them to die, and so therefore that was considered a whole life, and an ordinary whole life for many people. So this idea of thinking of this period in early as a preparation for adulthood requires all of these things to happen. And then the Sandbox comes to be around the same time. It's part of the kindergarten movement. It's when kindergarten comes together. In the book, I go into a lot of detail. I'm not going to go into total detail, but what I will tell you is that there's a book that I found in the library. I teach at Temple University, and I was in the stacks back when we still had stacks. Now it's all underground with robots that pick them out. But I was in there one day, and I found a book that was called the story of a sand lot, or something like. A sand pile. The story of a sand pile. And I'm trying to think of the author's name, right? It's a very famous psychologist whose name is eluding me right now. He's also the psychologist that invented adolescence, that coined the term adolescence, wrote a very long book on adolescence. And he wrote a book called The Story of a Sand Pile, and the book starts by explaining how angry parents are that kids are playing in the sand all day in their neighborhoods, right? All the parents are complaining, our kids are wasting their time, our kids have all these imaginary universes, they're getting lost, and he's trying to argue to them that there's benefits from this play in the sandbox. He's trying to say, when they play in the sandbox, they're actually learning civics, they're starting to learn some things about engineering, they're starting to think about conflict resolution, and this blew me away. Someone put it in the questions. The Story of a Sandpile by G. Stanley Hall. Thank you, because I couldn't remember it off the top of my head. He makes this argument, and as I'm doing it, I'm going, wait, that's exactly what I'm trying to prove to parents. So when you go back and you realize that it's like 120 years ago now, just 120 years ago, people were worried about what we consider to be this perfect play, right? And this was most people. Like, we had to convince people that this made sense. Then you have to go, well, does that mean that all of our assumptions right now are problematic too? Are they problematic? The argument I make in The New Childhood is not so much that our assumptions are problematic, but our assumptions are neglecting to take into consideration that all play is always situated within a cultural context, an economic context, and a technological context. I guess also a political context, and that most play exists to prepare kids to participate in the context in which the rest of us live. And all you have to do is think back to like the toys of the 1950s, when we were still trying to make all of the little girls play with easy bake ovens and toy vacuum cleaners, to realize that we actually, whether we mean to or not, use the toys to teach kids where our priorities are and what we think their adult lives should look like.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I hadn't thought about, because my kids are older, I hadn't thought about play in such a long time. And it dawned on me that, and I think a lot of parents have this reaction because of our sort of like technophobic anxiety. I didn't really think about gaming as play. I mean, I really didn't. It was like a time waster. It's eating up their brain. It's taking away from them, like reading books and like being with friends and peers in a more productive, interesting way. And so, I keep describing your book as very thought-provoking and provocative. And that was one of the provocative ideas, right? This reframing as even thinking about it as play. And, and we're from a generation, I think, many parents, we grew up gaming too, right? And we have this nostalgia about those types of games like Super Mario or Tetris in a way that we don't always extend to the games that like our children are playing with, right?
Yeah, and in fact, many of the games, it's important to remember that the games we played, and this is, I think, another reason that people are resistant to gaming, the games we played were often very individual, and and they were often like, it's what you did when when you were really bored, when no friends were around, when you're like, I'm going to spend nothing else to do. Like there's only 2 channels on television, nothing worth watching. Right. And the options were a lot more limited. Our kids today want to play games in a multiplayer setting where they are interacting with their friends. I remember often listening to my kids when they would have their headphones with the earpiece and play games when they were younger. And I would go, wow, you sound exactly like I sounded when I was on the phone with my friends. They weren't even talking about the game. They're talking about school while playing the game. It's just the sort of, it's a whole other kind of playground. It's important, I want to say, before we get any further into the questions, though, lest anyone misunderstands me, there's no part of me in this argument trying to say that Sandbox is obsolete and it's time for us to be digital. I'm all for both. That's the part of me that's saying that there's a lot of important skills that are learned through. I mean, look, I can go into all the research, and we may get to it tonight. The social emotional skills are learned through the kind of play that happens between peers on a playground. We know that, but there's also a very different set of social emotional skills that's learned in a digital playground. We don't want to get rid of either one. A digital playground doesn't have the embodied feedback, and that is problematic. But also, the embodied physical play doesn't have the digital feedback. And look how we're all interacting right now, right? We want our kids to develop digital social skills as well as in-person social skills.
Yeah, for sure. And, one thing I feel like a lot of parents struggle with is that single-mindedness around it, right? And one sentence I pulled out from your book is that being single-minded is not the same as being antisocial. And I struggle with that personally, right? I mean, I'm thinking about, today, like my son got so upset with me because I took away his tech, the rules that he needed to take a break, a couple hours break. And sure enough, I go back into his room and he's back on it. He defied the rule. And so it went away for longer. And like, he's in the kitchen and he's like pulled out the dog's food bin and he's spinning around on it in the middle of the kitchen. I come back in the kitchen, he's sitting on the bar, like his chin's like resting on my bottle of wine. He's like spinning it. He's bored out of his mind. And I think that's a lot of the fear, where it's like, they don't know how to then occupy themselves when that toy or that mechanism is away, right? Can you address that idea that single-mindedness is not being antisocial? Because
okay. Well, I think you have 2 different ideas here. One is the point with it. I think when the comment about single-mindedness not being yeah, I mean, let me answer it this way. I guess I'll just go here. The fact that someone struggles to entertain themselves without the most familiar things around them is not. We tend to think of that as a problem as parents. I'm certainly guilty of that. I'm certainly guilty of criticizing my kids, where I'm like, well, if you don't have a screen, then you don't know what to do with yourself. But also, like, it's not. It's a very adult skill to be able to reorganize your time away from what's familiar in easy ways. And even many adults aren't good at it, right? That's why, we're not very good at it. Look at how stressed people got during the pandemic without all their familiar ways of entertaining themselves, right? You might imagine if I were to say, everyone who complained during the pandemic just needs to learn how to read more books. You'd be like, you need to have more compassion, Jordan, right? Right. And that's often what we're saying to our kids. We're expecting them to have a level of maturity that is not even developmentally appropriate. I didn't have screens like my kids have, and I remember my parents constantly saying to my parents, "I'm bored," and they would go, "Only boring people get bored," right? But that didn't really help, right? That didn't make me know what to do, and it felt like a criticism. So I'm certainly not suggesting anyone should say that to their kids, but I am just pointing out that this is not a problem created by screens. This is something, if you take away, if you have a child who's never seen a screen, let's say they love Lego. If you take away their Lego, they're going to throw exactly the same temper tantrums they throw when you take away their screens, and they're going to also not know what to do with themselves. It is totally natural for small children to be single-minded, to become obsessive about whatever activity is their favorite at the moment. And so, that is certainly something as parents that we need to intervene and help them build the strategies for, but it's inaccurate to say that it is caused by digital play.
Sure. Yeah, no, I'm going to grapple with that. And I also, and I'm going to, we've got some questions in the chat, and I want to make sure we have time to get to that. So one of our attendees says that she really enjoyed the chapter on puberty and teaching them to navigate the digital world rather than checking out when they log in. How do you suggest doing this without them also feeling like it's an invasion of privacy?
Oh, you mean so this question seems to be about adults checking in on their
Yes.
on their kids. I think it's a good thing if they feel like it's an invasion of their privacy, is what I would say. This is not a private space. This is not the idea that their phone is a private space is just wrong. Google can see everything they do. Facebook can see everything they do, right? This is a surveillance space. And the last thing you want is your kids to normalize the idea that there's something safe and private about it. And I don't know a healthier way for someone to understand that there's no privacy online than for us to say to them, the parent who loves you unconditionally is going to be the one who teaches you to experience the invasion of privacy so that you learn the right boundaries before it becomes a large corporation that's invading your privacy. Lots of problems that I have, which is a topic for another night, about the problems with privacy law and the internet and all of those issues. But the bottom line is, you do not want your children to believe that that is a safe private space, not only because anything they send to their friends can get shared, and anyone with a teenager knows that can be like a social crisis, right? But also because it's just not it's not a safe space to feel private for any adult either.
Yeah, no, no, you're right. That's a brilliant answer. And we had talked about this a little bit during the book signing at the library when we met. Thank you for doing that, by the way. That was
really fun.
Nice. Yeah, it was fun, right? So you were sort of poo-pooing social media and how much you hate it, and it's clear that your kids are in that space. So I'm really curious, because one thing that's, again, another sort of brilliant thing about your book is that you've got the theory, you've got the history, but there's these really nuts and bolts of it that are awesome. Like, there's a section where you literally list out games that you suggest for parents to play with their kids. I'm totally going to do that with my kids over the weekend. I'm curious to know, like, what social media looks like in your home, and like, how do you navigate the privacy thing, right? Like, how are you shepherding your kids through that on like a nuts and bolts level? Like, they're at home and their phone's laying on the counter, and
yeah, I mean, look, the first thing I'll say, and this is going to be an unpopular answer, which is I gave my children access to social media much younger than the average. The average. I'm not sure what the current average is. When I wrote the book, which was about 2.5 years ago, the current it was 13 was the average age that someone got a smartphone. I bet it's earlier now, and I bet access to social media is earlier now. But but I don't have the data to say to prove that off the top of my head. But I started earlier, and the reason I started earlier is because the whole idea of waiting, we were talking about this earlier, while kids are not supposed to have accounts according to COPPA laws until they're 13, and so you probably want to have joint accounts. It has never made any sense to me that we wait until they're 13 to hand them these devices that are full of danger and threats and status hierarchies and social pressures. Why would we wait until the moment when their hormones start to rage and they are most likely to their brains are ready for reckless behavior and they don't want to listen to their parents to be the time when we introduce phones? This makes no sense to me. I wanted to introduce my phones and social media and all of these things to my kids at the time when they still wanted to say, yes, daddy, we want to do everything you say and make you proud. Teenagers don't want to do that anymore, which means I've lost the window to be able to help them develop healthy habits. And so I did that very early. And I not only did that early as someone who has a public persona anyway and has to do a large amount of social media, I often showed them how I was doing it, told them what I was thinking about. Sometimes that was the really, what's the right word? The vain side of editing photos, right? Making it showing them how I'm really thinking about what I'm showing and what's the story I'm telling and how it's going to be perceived, right? I'm teaching them how I think about putting a meaningful narrative out into the social media universe and the things I worry about. And again, as someone who has a public persona, I have to worry about a lot of things. I have to worry about, if I use the wrong word, will I offend people? I have to think about how I want to send the message. That's great for them to see from me because those are just much higher stake versions of the everyday social things that they have to contend with. So they got to see that modeled for them from doing it. We also, when I first allowed it, I only allowed them to follow or to connect online with either members of the family, cousins, aunts, uncles, or people from school. And anyone else beyond that, they had to ask. And I remember lots of times when they would go, Joey from school's cousin is on, and am I allowed to talk to them? And I would be like, yeah, sure. But like again, they were at an age where they were going to ask that and not just make up that decision themselves, which forced them in the long run to, even now that they're teenagers, I'm confident that they are asking the same questions every time they do this. I can't guarantee they always make the right decisions. In fact, they're teenagers, so I can guarantee they often make the wrong decisions because I know I did. But but I know that they're having the right dialogue as they think about it. Another way to just think about this is when you start with a much younger kid, let's deal with something many people are afraid of on social media. You start with a much younger kid, you can start by saying, you don't say butt. Once you get to an older kid, the question is whether or not you took a picture of your butt. Right? I would much rather be fighting and making the example around something super low stakes, like did you use a word that's slightly off color? Because who cares what words you really use when there's some words we do care about, but sexual words, like, as adults, we go, okay, you do that. You're going to do that as a teenager. You're going to say curse words. I'd rather argue with you about that when you're 10 than have you trying to send nude photos to your friends. And that's going to be the first time I get to try to intervene. So that's always been my attitude. And all of this is about modeling. As they get older, I spot check as much as I can. I ask them to see their phones as much as I can. Will kids find strategies to create fake accounts and hide them from their parents? Absolutely. I think most of the adults here can probably think of times when they did things behind their parents' back. That's a normal thing. But the important thing we want to do as parents is provide our kids with the strategies that allow us to feel like we can trust them as they navigate through that, to not make horrible decisions. Bad decisions are to be expected. Horrible, life-altering decisions are what we don't want. Right. And that's the same as I think about my teenagers when it comes to things like, am I going to allow you to go out with your friends? Am I going to allow you to go to party? Yeah, because I've spent many, many years teaching you how to cross streets, teaching you how to think about what's appropriate behavior, teaching you how to ask questions, and so I trust that you are going to at least do that in a way that is never going to be you're never going to cross over to the terrible side of things. You're just going to make reasonable mistakes.
Yeah. Wow. That is like blowing my mind right now, how you talked about that. It's really interesting. So we have another social media question.
Yeah.
Ken is worried that social media and the games, especially the pay to play, have highly addictive game mechanics. How can parents manage that side of screen time?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple issues here. One, a lot of the language of addiction around video games is really problematic when you get into the research, right? It really depends on how we decide we're going to define addiction. Are we going to define it as substance abuse, as a chemical dependency? Are we and if we define it as a chemical dependency, then really video games don't fit the argument. If you want to develop, many people try to get around that by arguing that games then I think assume that this is what this question is about, the dopamine release. This is something we hear about a lot in the news. That there's dopamine release from the notifications and the dings and the kind of gambling mechanics, the same things they use in Vegas. That is absolutely true, but it's important to have a better understanding of how dopamine really functions. The fact is, everything that gives us a positive experience, a positive sensation, depends on dopamine release. Eating pizza releases dopamine. Kissing someone releases dopamine. Getting good grades releases dopamines. Absolutely, video games release dopamine when they feel good, as does social media. Does it compare to anywhere near the kind of dopamine release that would happen if you were using cocaine, for example? No, not even close. In fact, video games is about the same as a piece of pizza. Now, are the video games organized to make those dopamine hits happen in a really regular way that's hard to move away from? Absolutely. But again, so is television, so is advertising, right? Like, that's a capitalist issue. That's not a technology issue. And we can have a debate about whether we want to allow capitalism to function in a way where those selling things are going to be able to try to manipulate our dopamine release in order to get more of our attention. I think it's a worthy debate for us to have as a culture. Are we comfortable with giving companies free rein in that way, and decide where that boundary is? But you can't blame that on video games, because that's in everything we do, right? When they figure out how to film a football game, why do you think they have microphones on the field so you can hear more than you would if you were there on purpose? Because they know it gives you dopamine release and makes you stay more engaged in watching the game, so that you'll get to the commercials, so that you'll buy the Budweiser and the Coca-Cola and the Fritos, right? That all of that is the same process. How do we monitor that as parents? Our goal as parents needs to be to equip our kids with the strategies to recognize when that's happening and to make good decisions. Are they going to make bad decisions? As I said, absolutely. That's the worst thing about parenting. You have to nag them all day long. You go, wrong decision, wrong decision. If you call, I'm 43 years old. If I gave you my mom's phone number, she'd be like, I feel like I still have to call him sometimes and tell him he's making the wrong decisions, right? So that's a totally normal thing. Yes, we need to monitor it. Yes, we need to be worried about it. And yes, we need to recognize that there are unique challenges to social media, but we don't need to imagine that this is somehow the devil's temptation, that the idea that it's irresistible. I actually think this is an invention of the tech companies to sell more advertising. They go, guess what? We're so good at this, nobody can turn away. It's not true. I turn away. Lots of people turn away. What we have to do is teach our kids to prioritize their ability to turn away rather than their ability to stay engaged. Is that hard? Yes. Do kids get mad when you tell them to do what they want to do? Yes, but they do it no matter what. And that's the hardest thing about parenting, I would say, are those moments when you're doing what's in the best interest of your child, and your child cries and screams and says they hate you, right? Like that's the terrible thing about what it means to be a parent. I like to tell my kids all the time, though, that I'm not trying to create happy kids. I'm trying to create happy 35-year-olds.
Yeah, that's a good quote. I'm going to start using that. Yeah, I think what parents, a lot of times what they're responding to is like not wanting that conflict, right? And if it wasn't tech, it would be something else. I mean, one sort of like really simple thing that you talked about that really tracked with me and my experience growing up was this just the fact that the statistics show that this generation isn't partaking in any more media than our generation did, right? Like Gen Z, the millennial, the older, the geriatric millennials among us, right? Like my parents were constant. I mean, I had like the big thing was like cable. I had cable in my room. It'd be on in the background while I was doing my homework. I was a very good student, right? But it was there constantly. It was like my friend, my companion in a lot of ways. And when I didn't have cable, I'd go to my friends' houses and we'd watch like hours of music videos, right? Like that little tidbit like really tracked for me in my experience. And I'd imagine that a lot of the folks on this call had that similar experience and can hopefully see that that maybe their children are not like lost to the internet, so to speak. But we've got
and another point there is like I was a total nerd as a kid, and I remember so many fights with my parents when we would like go to holiday dinners at my grandparents' house, and I'd be like, "Can I just sit in the corner and read a book?" And they'd be like, "No, you have to engage with your cousins and your aunts and your uncles." And I was like, "But I just want to read." And they're like, "That's not good behavior to sit in the corner and read a book. It's antisocial." That's hard for us to imagine now because we have a new version of antisocial, right? I bet there's parents on here who are like, "I wish that my kid would read." I want to read, but that's again, that's what I meant when I said there's single-mindedness that is normal. There's single-mindedness that is normal for kids, and just because we are unfamiliar with the thing that their single-minded attention is on doesn't mean that the single-mindedness is horrible. It absolutely does mean that we need to intervene and teach them good self-regulation skills so that they know which are appropriate times to be single-minded and which are inappropriate times. My mom was right. You don't sit at grandma's house and read a book. And I had to learn that when you're with someone, you should be present, whether you're bored or not.
Right. Yeah. I mean, another pearl clutching moment for me was this idea, this metaphor of the device being a transitional object, right? Like it's the teddy bear. That made me so uncomfortable. And, I'd love for you to talk about that and flesh out more like how we kind of navigate that. And like, I'm sure it's fine to bring the table to the dinner, to the Thanksgiving feast, but does the cell phone belong at the Thanksgiving feast with the family, right?
Okay.
It's like it was a very uncomfortable analogy for me personally.
No, I mean, in retrospect, I would say if I could go back and rewrite that part, I think there's some things that I didn't make clear enough, because you're not the first person who's brought this up. One, I used the teddy bear as an example of a transitional object because one, to just do the same thing that I did with the Sandbox a few moments ago. The teddy bear is it's named after Teddy Roosevelt. It's an invention. It's an invention that is directly connected to the time of Teddy Roosevelt, and not many people had it until 30, 40 years later. Now we consider every kid as a teddy bear, but at the time it was a brand new thing. And I tell the whole story in the book. So in the interest of time, I won't tell you the whole story, but it's a fascinating story of how it gets named the teddy bear. The idea of a transitional object is probably the most famous one, even more famous than D.W. Winnicott's theory, which is where the term comes from, is Linus. Is it Linus? Yeah, Linus is Blanky from Peanuts, from the Peanuts cartoon, and as right, the security blanket. That's even where the term security blanket comes from Peanuts, not the other way around. The transitional object is a comfort object, and there's two different phases, according to D.W. Winnicott, in which kids use transitional objects. One is not really an object, but they mean objects in a larger object relations psychology sense, but you don't have to worry about that. I'll make this clear in a second. The first phase is the teddy bear, okay? And that's a much younger phase. All of our kids had teddy bears. The idea of the transitional object is kids are learning to reconcile the difference between their internal reality and the external reality, right? We as adults, we all get this, right? Sometimes I have a thought in my head. Often you don't understand exactly what I'm saying, and I have to deal with this disconnect of why don't you understand me, right? Why are these two different things? That doesn't mean there's something wrong with me. And the way we learn that as a small child is because our parents allow us to have this fantasy object that's somewhere in between our internal world and our external world, right? The child, of course, understands the teddy bear is not real, but when we talk to the teddy bear, when the teddy bear talks to the child, this allows them to take their internal thoughts, project it outside so they can better manage this sort of essential problem with human consciousness, which is the disconnect between internal and external. That's the first transitional object. I'm not really equating the phone to that one, right? Like there's no reason a small child should have a phone, right? I'm totally with most researchers on this, right? There's no, I'm not 100% zero screen time for babies and toddlers. The whole reason that advice exists is because people are terrified that if they spend too much time watching videos, they will not get eye contact, they will not get serve and return interactions with the caregivers around them, and those are such essential things. That being said, I also want anyone who's got a baby to know that I remember what it was like to have a baby. Nothing is going to happen to your baby if you let them watch a video for 10 minutes while you shower, right? And let it be a peace of mind, okay? Right? Take it away after the 10 minutes because you don't want them to not have human interaction. But it's a great tool so that you can shower in those early days when it's almost impossible to shower, right? But the part where I'm comparing the phone to that is actually for teenagers, and it's actually for preteens, tweens, pubescent, right? Where this is another phase where we move into where we start to create transitional spaces, not transitional objects. So the famous ones we see in TV, right? If you think of Happy Days and Al's restaurant, Sock Hop with the jukebox and Fonzie, and this was a kid's space, right, with different rules than home, different rules than school. The kids' space, the 7-Eleven parking lot. This is a kids' space. It's a sort of mythical, magical space where they get to do kids stuff, where they develop their own social rules, their own ability to develop social hierarchies outside of parents, and allows them to sort of challenge their parents who they're just discovering are fallible, right? That's what's so hard about being a kid in puberty or adolescence, right? Is that you always loved this parent, you thought they were perfect, suddenly you just realize they're human and you're mad at them for being human, right? So you need a space where you get to be like, now I have to be my own authority, and you do that with like-minded friends. My point is that that's what's really going on with in the social media smartphone space, is that they're finding a private space. Again, not private, you're allowed to look at it, just like you're allowed to drive by the 7-Eleven parking lot and make sure nobody's doing drugs, right? Like we do that as parents, we need to check on them, right? But it is still a space that's their space, that they get to create rules and social norms and all of those things. And that allows them to start to live into the idea of themselves as their own authority, as their own autonomous being. And so in that sense, I think it's important. And one of the things, to add to that, to help parents to get really practical on this, somebody asked us earlier about Instagram and going on vacations, right? This was something I did with my kids a lot early, was I said, use Instagram on vacations, because often what we do in transitional spaces, and what we all definitely do on the internet, is it's an opportunity for us to articulate our personal narrative. And it's an opportunity for us to tell our own story, right? And in many ways, Instagram can, as long as it's managed, as long as you're watching it as a parent, as long as you're, I would definitely suggest for younger kids, you make the account private, you control who they're allowed to talk to. For the kids I worried more about than the others, I also had their account on my phone, so I could switch between it and see the messages and all of those things. No, I didn't do that for all the kids, but I did it for some, because depending on who they were and what I thought the dangers were. But the fact is, it's really something we all need to do, is to tell our stories. It's like showing a slideshow after you go to the Grand Canyon to all your friends. Like if you think about the 70s, when you would invite, I was barely alive, but the show, the image on TV is you invite everyone over after you go to France and you show them your slideshow and everyone's bored, right? but that's ultimately what that is I am telling the story of the adventure that I went on, which is both a way for me to, do some humble bragging, but also a way for me to live into my own sense of self. It's a way for me to figure out who I am and what that experience means to me, and how I want to integrate it into my own sense, my own identity. And so that's what kids are often doing in these social media spaces. If we think it's terrible, we'll sit there and go, wow, I used to swim laps because I all the time. And I would always see these teenagers, they would come in, they'd spend more time taking pictures than they spent swimming, because they do like 25 minutes of Instagram, then 5 minutes swimming, and then leave, right? And at first I went, that's terrible. But then I realized, oh wait, no, that's not really terrible. Like, they're just trying to tell their story. Like, in fact, they're trying to figure out how to construct a meaningful narrative about this swimming experience. That's something we all need to do. That's what we do in therapy. If you send a kid to therapy, that's all they do. That's what sand play is about. That's why you act things out with toys. It goes, how do you tell your story? How do you empower yourself by articulating it? And so what we really need to do as parents is to allow our kids to do that, hold their hands while they do it, teach them positive ways of doing it, intervene when they're doing it in negative ways, but support them through it. Because otherwise, they're going to find ways to do it anyway, and they're going to do it without our mentoring.
Yeah, no, that was really beautiful. And I completely agree with you, right? I mean, that's what we do as humans, is we tell stories about ourselves, our world. And I think the upside of social media is the ability to craft that narrative and to storytell. And then there's the dark side, right? One thing I worry about is sort of what's different from, right, like maybe traditional ways of interacting socially, is the anonymity of the internet, right? And I get the parental anxiety around it, right? Like, if you're seeing it as a way to self-actualize, and also to build an ethics, right? Because you really talk about that as, like, you talk about gaming and your persona and your interactions online as a form of civic participation, right? If those are kind of the goals, and these are these are tools to be able to do that, how can you do those things when you're able to be anonymous in the space? And also, anonymous people that anonymity can lead to, like, really awful bullying, where there are no kind of repercussions or protections from. How do you help your children navigate through that aspects of it, right? I mean, you talked about some of them, right? You can only be friends with your cousins and your family.
Yeah, you have to put on age appropriate parameters, I think, and you have to make sure you trust their ability to make sense of what's happening in these spaces before, and you slowly allow, just like anything else, right? You slowly allow more and more freedoms as your confidence this is all something we do naturally when it comes to almost every other part of our kids' lives, right? Like we barely have to think about it, right? Like I'll use a perfect example with really little kids. When my kids were toddlers, I took them to the playground. The first time they tried to climb the ladder, I stood right underneath them and held them. And then slowly my hands got further and further and further away until I was sure they weren't going to fall down and break their heads open, right? By the way, the other thing I did was I spent most of that time at the playground saying, be kind, don't hit, don't call people names until I was confident that they knew how to have social interactions. We're not doing any of that for social media. Right? And so it's not at all surprising that so many people are going, wow, I let my kids loose on social media and it was a horrible experience. Well, no one taught them how to do it. It's not surprising to me that we have so many celebrities and politicians that are horrible on social media. They never had parents who said, these are the right ways to behave when you're using these kinds of spaces and these kinds of tools. That's our responsibility now, is to raise a generation that's better at it than we are, right? To raise a generation that actually understands where the limits and boundaries are of human discourse, and etiquette and expectations. So that's one thing. But the thing I'll say to you about the worry, I want to address some of the worries, because the media loves to talk about the worries, right? It's just constant on the media.
I have to say, this is like one of the first books that didn't focus on the worries, right? There's plenty of books out there about the worries.
Absolutely. And most of the worries, when you look into them, are not grounded in research, right? So you brought up bullying because of anonymity. This is something we've been scared of since the very beginning of the internet. I remember when it was still dial-up and people like, that's when we still called it cyber. Is when we came up with the term cyberbullying, right? That's how old this fear is. When they've done studies of talking to kids almost all say they have experienced some kind of in-person bullying. Very few say they've experienced cyber bullying. So this idea that it's this space that somehow makes it worse. Now, I'm not saying there's none. Of course, there's a ton of it. I've seen it in my own Facebook feed all the time, like really bad behavior. We've seen very famous people do terrible bullying online that ends up all over the news. Yes, it happens. But the idea that it's worse there is not actually backed up by the research. Let's deal with some of the other ones, right? There seems to be the terrible fear that came out with the so-called Facebook, their studies that it's bad for teen girls, right? First of all, that was a study that was based on 40 respondents, and it was not even a representative sample of anyone except for girls that already reported having body image issues, who said it made them worse. When they do really large studies, what they find is that that's not true, that in most cases, teenagers find positive outlets through social media, that it's kids who, and you can just use common sense to see this, right? The amount of people, LGBTQ kids who are completely marginalized in their school communities, who are able to find communities online where they go, wow, there's people who feel like me and who are going through the things. People with eating disorders, this is one we've known about for almost a decade, that the amount of support they're finding online and how much that's allowing them to deal with real problems rather than just hide them from everyone is unbelievable, right? Such a positive in those people's lives. Now, I don't want anyone to think I'm completely trying to gloss over the negative, because that same thing that allows marginalized folks to find like-minded people and communities is also how we end up with the QAnons, right? It's also how we end up with the very hateful groups of people who are able to find each other and therefore become amplified in their ability to hate. But that's not, again, this is not social media that's causing the hate. This is the fact that there are marginalized people that have that are able to find like-minded groups, and this is a technology that's very good at that. We don't blame the technology for that. There's a positive and a negative there. As for, I wrote an article about this that got a lot of. As for the question of is body image worse because of social media, to me, that's just an absurd question. And you just have to have missed all of feminist thought for the last 6 decades to realize that body image is not a new issue, and that if anything, it's getting better. And so stop blaming social media.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, right? I mean, social media has played such a large role in sort of expanding our notions of like, what do bodies look like and what are acceptable bodies, right?
Yeah, I think to some degree, social media has done a lot of allowing us to talk about existing problems. And I think we're often mistaking social media as the cause of those problems, because we were able to, not even that we were able to ignore them, we didn't even know about it, right? Like there's so many kids who wouldn't even have told you they were having body image issues until social media allowed them to realize that this is actually an issue and not just something wrong with me.
Right. Yeah, I've got a social media issue or a question here, and
yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to read it. You might have addressed quite a bit of it, but I don't want to miss it. And we have another question in the chat as well. So most of what I read in your book focused on video games. Do you view social media as part of this virtual playground? How do you feel it fits into this new childhood? If so, how do you help your kids navigate? I mean, you addressed a lot of that. Is there anything else that you want to bring up as it relates to
the only thing I would say is that it is true that I focused on video games more in the book. At the time, there was a lot more research about video games. And one of the things that was really important to me in a book that's going to be so different than the common narrative is that you really need to back it up with real research. And so it just didn't exist, but I've been looking at it ever since, because it just keeps getting more and more and more. And in fact, it's very similar. I mean, you have to, social media is also a gamified play space in many ways, especially if you think of the sandbox analogy, right? It's still just a sandbox in which we make up our stories that are somewhat representative of who we are on the inside, where we try on different personas, where we try on different versions of ourselves, and we try interacting and commenting and doing all of those things together. That's what we do as adults. That's what we do as kids. What are we doing when I share pictures of my kids with my cousins? I'm just trying to tell my family narrative, right? Which is part real and part fantasy, right? Part aspirational and part true fact, right? Which is the same as what it goes, if you walked into my kitchen, you'd see a million framed photographs of my kids on vacation. That is also part fantasy, because there was a lot of crying on those vacations that I don't show in the photographs.
I think that's every vacation.
Of course, that's what I'm saying. We often like to go, social media, everyone's lying about how great their lives are. So is your wedding album. So is your right. I mean, that's what we do as humans. That's not something to say is a problem, right? Like that's we want to articulate our narratives in ways that make us feel fulfilled and happy in the world.
Yeah. I mean, that brings me to this was one of the last things that really sort of stood out for me is you were talking about like the role of parents to create sort of like this analog to the digital space, right? You talked about how for you and your family, you really grounded in like history, specifically antiquity. There's a lot of like family artifacts in your home. Can you flush that out for folks, that idea about like the sort of role that parents have to play, right? Creating this like very sort of stable space to like, I don't want to say retreat to. I'll let you speak.
I think you're talking about. I think you're talking about the way. I mean, it's part of what I was just saying. I'll give a few, and it's an idea that comes from the famous essayist Susan Sontag, which is the way that we fill our homes with artifacts that tell our story, right? And I was just talking about it with photos, but how do you do it? I mean, I'll use photos as an example again, and I'll tell a personal story. here. Before I moved in with my current wife, who's my second wife, and her two children, who are now my stepchildren, I had a kitchen where we ate dinner, my two sons and I, and in it were pictures of all of the adventures that we had gone on together. As someone who gets to do speaking a lot, I am really fortunate that other people are often paying for me to go to fantastic places, and I often used to bring my kids before the pandemic to those places. So all these pictures of my kids in Greece and my kids in France, and look, and in museums, and looking at, and I surrounded the house with them to say, hey, this is us, this is who we are, this is our identity as a family. Well, when I moved in with my current wife, I had to really rethink what I was going to do with those pictures, because they didn't include all four kids. So I went, luckily we had also been on many trips with all four of the kids. So I went through and framed all of those and took off the ones that were just my kids, so that immediately when they came into a new house, I was going, these artifacts represent who we are and show that we're a family, and show that we have love, and show that we have history, and show that we have good times together. That's part of what we have to do for our kids all the time. And we have to do it in multiple places. We do it in school. We do it when we sit at the dinner table, when we talk about memories. Like, think about how many of your memories are really just stories that your parents told you over and over and over again. What you're doing is helping kids create narratives so that they can have a meaningful experience in the world, right? Their world is full of danger. The world is full of problems. The world is full of potential negative influences, not just digital technology, everywhere on our televisions. And we do a lot of going, hey, I'm going to tell you your story so that you are able to confront the difficult things about being a human in the world, make a meaningful narrative about it, and move through in a way that's fulfilling to you. That's what we have to prepare our kids to do, both online and off. Most of us are pretty good at doing it offline. But we're so confused about digital. We're so confused about the online world that we stink at doing it on online. And that terrifies me. I don't want anyone who's here to think that I am super pro video games. There's nothing to worry about. Social media, there's nothing to worry about. There's a ton to worry about. And the thing that worries me the most about it is that in most cases, what's happening is kids are going into their room, closing the door, and making sense of it themselves, or with the help of some YouTubers, right, who are telling them how to think about their world. I don't know what those YouTubers are saying. I want them to think about their world in a way that's aligned with my values, which are values that come from my parents, that come from my culture, that come from my religious background, that come from my intellectual background, that come from my community. And I want to teach them how to bring those values and ethics to everything they do online and off. And to think that they're going to magically figure out how to do that for an online space without us actually holding their hand the same way we held their hand for 12 years as they, all right, maybe not 12 years as they crossed the street, but 7-8 years as they crossed the street, is naive. If you want to know why social media is so scary, so dangerous, having adverse effects on people, it's because we haven't yet learned, and I'm not blaming people for this because it's a new thing, right? We haven't yet learned how we parent people through this and mentor people through this difficult process. And we need to focus on that. But mostly we run around focusing on, I'm worried about what's going to happen if they're exposed to it. And yeah, I'm worried what they're going to happen if they're exposed to it too. But just like everything else in life, the way you manage that is not by going, let me hide it from them. It's by going, let me equip them to deal with that exposure.
Well, you've certainly given me a lot to think about, and I'm reframing a lot of my thoughts around this. I also want to be really mindful of time. I think we're over by quite a bit. But I do want to get to this last question in the chat, and also give you an opportunity to talk about your new book, Father Figure. So we've got a question from Amber, and it's about the monitoring of the tech. Do you always just check in face to face, or do you use some kind of technology in your home to help regulate access and content? I know there are ways to limit internet access, time to be online, etc. I can't help feeling big brotherish with that type of surveying. So I tend to avoid the topic altogether by limiting my kids' screens.
Yeah, it's a great question. In general, I'll say I'm not very fond of the technological methods of intervention, only because I think our goal is not to control, again, our goal is not to make perfect kids, it's to make perfect 35-year-olds, and we want to teach them the skills to self-regulate that. And if you have like the iPad or the Kindle have all these things to, like, you control what the kids can do, well, then you're not actually teaching them to make their decisions. You're actually teaching them that these things manage it for them. That being said, I did for many, many years, only recent, well, I didn't even change it. For many years, and especially during the pandemic, I did program the internet router in my house to go off at specific times. It changed depending on their age, but I'll make up a time now. Let's say on weekdays it was 10 p.m. It just went off. There was no way to be on the internet after 10 p.m. And on weekends, maybe it was 11, right? That all depends on age. So I'm not telling, don't be like, that's the right timing, right? It depends on your kids. It depends on the age, because otherwise they would spend all night up, and I wasn't always awake. So I didn't want to have to monitor it. And I also wanted it had to be that way in order to control it on some level. But that was not me controlling the content as much as me controlling their access to the internet. Eventually, they learned how to outsmart it. They learned how to change their DNS address in order to do it, and there was not much I could do. But the fact is, I remember them coming to me, going, "We figured it out. We're so smart." And months after I had realized they had figured it out, they finally confessed. And I was like, "Yeah, but the joke is on you guys, because by the time you figured it out, you had already built sleeping habits where you went to bed at reasonable times, which was my only goal from the beginning." so now they don't try to stay up till 2 a.m. playing games, because it's just they realized they're happier, right? That's the bottom line. When kids are up all night using digital stuff, they don't feel good either. They feel it's the same as when you and I end up staying up too late binging something on Netflix. We're like, why did we watch the next episode, right? It feels crappy. We go, couldn't we have been more responsible? They feel the same way. And so by me intervening by setting a thing, I actually taught them to manage what they wanted to do in the first place. They just weren't quite capable. Do they sometimes make mistakes and stay up too late? Yeah. And often they say to me, "I really screwed up last night. I stayed up too late watching something, and now I felt horrible in school all day, and I really need to think about how to manage that better." And that's what we want from kids. We don't want them to be perfect. We want them to be able to say, "I recognize my mistake. I'm going to try to develop strategies to manage it better in the future."
Great. Well, I could talk all night with you. We don't have all night. I want to pivot to your new book, Father Figure, which I believe.
Yeah, I'll move to this side, so like that's
yes,
the cover, right?
that's it. It's on my shelf right here, and I wish we could talk more about this book. In many ways, it's more exciting to me than The New Childhood for a lot of reasons. And I actually read them in tandem. I thought it's almost like a companion piece. They speak to each other in really interesting, beautiful ways. And I'd love for you to talk to our parents about it and tell us about Father Figure.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think they're, in many ways, I think they are similar books, in that in both books, what I am doing is acknowledging that there's a change in the culture, and acknowledging that adults aren't always equipped to handle those changes in the culture, and are often making bad decisions because of their fear of not knowing what's best. And I wanted to guide parents to think about how they might make better decisions, right? So the book is Father Figure: How to Be a Feminist Dad. It came out of me just recognizing that in almost every father that I ever talked to had really, really well-meaning intentions. Especially, they wanted a world that was more equitable. They wanted a world of more gender equity. Absolutely, like you never meet any. Maybe you do, but you rarely meet people who are like, I'm not for gender equity, right? But we all know that many of us are still reinforcing and maintaining things that are not equitable, and we're doing it out of habit. We're doing it out of generational cycles of bad ways of thinking about masculinity, bad ways of thinking about femininity that are really hard to undo when you're a parent, because you're also imitating your own parents to some degree. And even if you're not imitating your parents, you're going like the opposite direction, which is still then based on your parents, right? So there's so many problematic things in that, and I wanted to equip especially men, but it's a book that that is written for everyone, to go, how do we think about the problematic ways that gender is showing up in our relationship with our children and our spouses. And it's not just, it's definitely not a book. I don't think it's like men are bad in any way. In fact, if anything, it's a book that says we're all doing troublesome things when it comes to the way we think about our family norms. And they're things that are creating anxiety for our kids. And as you were saying, it's a great companion piece, because I think it's true that many of the things we're most worried about on social media, in terms of things like bullying, in terms of things like social problems, are often things that exist because of gender inequities in our culture that we don't like, almost nobody likes, but also almost nobody seems willing to say, I take responsibility for trying to move through the world as an adult who's teaching children to really think about these things in a very different way. And I have to acknowledge that I am personally myself, I'm saying this as a Jordan, and if you read the book, you'll realize almost every chapter in this book starts with me going, here is where I screwed up. Here is where I am culpable for bad things that have caused that I wish I had not done in my parenting experience. And then I go into the theory about why those things are important.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and I think it's often difficult for a lot of people, that part of it, right? Because it feels so like it feels like dangerous to the self, like, oh my gosh, I'm a bad person. Quickly before I continue, I just wanted to let you know that Zoe has dropped a link in the chat where you can get signed copies of both of these books from one of our local bookstores, Main Point Books. 20% of the sales go back to us. So thank you, Main Point Books, for being a partner in this.
Yes, thank
you. If you appreciated this conversation and would like to see more of it, we would love for you to send a donation to the PTO so that we can do that in the future. To continue on your point about father figure, I think it's so powerful that you start with like sort of your own missteps around this, because I think whether we're talking about like gender inequality or racism or any of these large sort of structural inequalities, right? There's such a fear that you're gonna like say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, and it paralyzes you. It prevents you from doing better, but because you don't want to make that initial mistake. And so for me, that was like such a way to model, right? You talk about modeling a lot in the new childhood, and you do that in the way that you've structured father figure. And one of the questions I have for you is, you talk about like living with 4 boys. I think it's 4 boys, right?
Three boys and one girl.
And one girl. And, oftentimes when you're talking about gender inequality, right, the onus is, or racial inequality, the onus is on the folks that are like victimized by the system, right? And for me, such a big part of this is like not just preparing our girls for a world that is sexist, but to like teach our boys better, right? And I'd love to end on that, your thoughts around that and your experiences being the father of 3 boys and 1 girl, all in their teen years, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just give a quick example to make that point, which is you know, you made the point well that we do a lot of preparing, we do a lot of talking about how to empower girls, and we do a lot of talking about how to protect girls and how to get them to be, you know, we do a lot of teaching girls about consent, about being careful, about you know, let's just deal with sex. I mean, I'll just do it. I'll just go for it, right? We do a lot of teaching girls to be wary of potential abuse, harassment, rape, everything. You know what we don't do a lot of? We don't do a lot of teaching boys how to really think about the nuances of intimacy. And intimacy is confusing, right? You know, one of the sad things about the way we're talking about it so often in the media right now is we act like it's a very clear line about what's okay and what's not okay, and it's often confusing. We all have to admit, like, all of us are confused sometimes when we're in intimate situations. The problem is we are not preparing our boys to be able to go, how do I evaluate this situation? How do I navigate this blurry line and make a decision about how I should behave in this admittedly confusing moment? And so, you know, we can't put the onus all on the girls to avoid rapey things. We also have to teach the boys to not find themselves in situations that they might, you know, we know this statistically, it's so, we know it completely. Most rape is date rape and was not intentional, right? So how do we get to make sure that doesn't happen? We have to teach boys to be able to recognize their behaviors with a lot more nuance and a lot more specific articulation. Then we can get out of these stupid conversations that we have, like, oh no, you're not allowed to compliment anyone anymore, right? Yeah, if you don't have the nuance with which to evaluate whether your compliment is a compliment or a harassment, then yeah, you probably shouldn't. But if you have the nuance, you absolutely can.
Fantastic. Well, I am so grateful to you for being with us tonight and sharing your expertise and your thoughts with us. And I want to thank all of the partners in this, the library and my board and the families in our community for being so generous and allowing us to put on these programs for our community. And I hope this isn't our last conversation, Jordan.
I hope so too.
Yeah. All right, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, everybody else.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night.